Chapter 5. Women Liberated but Not Emancipated. To effect woman's complete emancipation and make her the equal of man, it is necessary to be socialized and for women to participate in common productive labor. Then women will occupy the same position as men. Lenin, 1919. Maria Fyodorovna Malechauvinism is an imposing woman in her late 40s with the looks and tall stature of a Russian Ethel Merman and a fondness for singing sad romances about her youth. She has a firm jaw, a strong handshake, a wide smile, and a self-confident, gregarious manner that I found as commanding as it was comradely. I was introduced to her in Murmansk, the Arctic port made famous by Allied war convoys during World War II, by Nikolai Belyayev, editor of Polar Truth, the local Communist Party newspaper. Clearly, he was in awe of her. Like any foreigner who has traveled much in the Soviet Union, I meet a number of representational women in posts of public prominence: deputy premier in Georgia, president of the Yakut Republic of Siberia, a peace committee leader in Moscow, a senior trade union official in Latvia. Most were really examples of Soviet tokenism, women who held figurehead positions rather than exercising real authority. But Maria Fyodorovna was the most memorable career woman I encountered in Russia because she had achieved genuine responsibility and power. Not only had she single-handedly reared 2 sons to join the Murmansk fishing fleets, but she had bulldozed her way into the top strata of the Murmansk power hierarchy to become boss of the Rybokombinat, the fish processing plant, with 4,500 workers under her command. She had earned a seat on Gorkom, the Communist Party committee that runs the city. With her black hair tied back in a bun, simple gold earrings, and wearing a plain sea-green dress, she cut quite a different figure from glamorous American feminists like Gloria Steinem, but she was a kindred spirit. In America, she would have been called a rugged individualist with all the assertive personal characteristics which that implies. Sturdy of build, energetic, efficient, intelligent, strong-willed, she epitomized the Russian women who boldly stepped into industry in the post-war years when Russia was most grievously deprived of her men, and very unusual even for that era, she had made her way in the man's world of management. I was struck that she was more poised than many Soviet men I met, for unlike most officials who gather the phalanx of aides as reinforcements for any meeting with foreigners, she met me alone. When I asked how she had fared in the masculine domain of management, she replied with a wide smile that exposed 2 perfect rows of teeth. She had supervised men, she said simply, and it had been no problem. With amusement, she recalled occasions when at banquets, as the only woman among male executives and important officials, she would hear some man give a toast to the women who they had left at home. Puckishly, she would rise to offer a rebuttal toast to the men, reminding them that not all the women were at home. To Maria Fyodorovna, it was only natural that a woman should hold her $800 a month job as director of the fish processing plant. 85% of our workers in this plant are women, she asserted. How could they have such a plant without a woman in charge? Her predecessor had also been a woman, but before that the plant had been run by men. She twitted me and Belyayev good-naturedly about how hard we would have to work in her plant because of the high standards she maintained. With a docile need, Belyayev agreed she was a no-nonsense boss. There were snow flurries in the air when we toured the 9 rambling factories, warehouses, refrigeration lockers, and docks that she was in charge of. I saw only 3 men on the job, but women were everywhere outside, burly women in padded blue cotton jackets, orange safety shirts, and layers of thick woolen stockings, chopped ice, shoveled snow, or worked in the holds of fishing trawlers. Inside, young women, girls they seemed to me, with their slender, sallow faces, slithered around a water-soaked floor in rubber boots and aprons, lugging ponderous, frozen slabs of fish and hoisting them with difficulty into bins. Elsewhere, teams of older women, hair tied back in kerchiefs, cut off the heads and tails of herring, cod, or sea perch, and with incredible speed and dexterity trussed them up in little slings to be hung on racks for smoking, thanks to an automatic 50% pay bonus for working. In the Arctic region, the women in Maria Fyodorovna's factory made anywhere from $150 to $400 a month, and clearly they worked hard for it. Many of them were the wives of the fishermen who brought in the catch. Maria Fyodorovna, who had spent 20 years in the plant, knew most of the workers personally and joked with them in her hearty, patronizing way, all the while explaining to me the process of smoking, curing, treating the catch, canning it, and describing where the 190 million output of her plant would be marketed. People want less salt on their fish nowadays than before, she said, so we have to make it tastier. As we walked along, she remembered coming to Murmansk 25 years before from Shatura, a town near Moscow, after graduating from a fishery institute. She had known a rough life in the cold northern outpost. Her marriage had ended unhappily, but she had never been tempted to go back to the milder climates of central Russia. She had become so accustomed to the severe Arctic weather that doctors had advised her against vacationing in the far south because it would be bad for her heart. "I can't stand too much heat," she confessed, tucking a loose hair back in her bun. Maria Fyodorovna is the kind of woman that Soviet officials like to have foreigners meet because she substantiates their claim that Soviet women are the most equal in the world. Long ago, the Stalinist Constitution of 1936 declared their equal rights with men in all spheres of economic, state, cultural, public, and political life, which American women libers were still battling to get added to the American Constitution in the mid-70s. On paper, Soviet women already have it made. They are officially liberated. Abortions are legal. 4-month paid maternity leaves are written into law, and jobs must be kept for new mothers for a year. A network of state-subsidized daycare centers has been set up nationwide and cares for 10 million preschoolers. Equal pay for equal work is established as a principle. A higher proportion of Soviet women work than in any other industrialized country, and a modest number have achieved career success. Vast numbers have completed higher education and work beside men in science, industry, and government. Yet despite these achievements and the enormous propaganda hoopla about women in the Soviet media, Soviet women remain a distinctly second sex. If any large segment of the population has been exploited by the system, it is women. Even 3 decades after World War II, when educated urban women are watching their figures, chasing Western fashions, and worrying more about their femininity than Russian women ever found time to do in the past, women still do the bulk of the low-paying, back-breaking, dirty manual labor. They shoulder a wearisome double burden of work, plus what Lenin termed domestic slavery. Justifiably, they complain of inadequate relief from the competing tensions of career and family. From afar or on hurried visits to the Soviet Union, where they have met occasional feminine successes, like Maria Fyodorovna, some American women speak enviously of their Soviet counterparts, but life looks different up close. No American woman I encountered who had lived among Russians long enough to have a genuine feel for what their lives entail would think of swapping places. The main reason, as Russian women themselves say, is that, contrary to Lenin's dictum, mass access to the job market has not proven the panacea that either Lenin or some Western feminist presumed. In many ways, it has made life more trying. Some Russian women even feel so disadvantaged that one confided candidly to an American woman I knew, "I hope my child is a boy, not a girl. As a boy, his life would be so much easier." In spite of the declared Marxist-Leninist commitment to feminine equality, the strong tradition of male chauvinism in Russian life has been only mildly moderated by the Soviets. The enduring assumptions of male superiority and feminine subservience come through a Russian humor so often revealing of deep-set attitudes. I remember a popular stage skit put on by a Leningrad satirical troupe in which 4 husky women sit at home, playing cards, getting roaring drunk, singing raucous songs, and telling old war stories, while a hen-pecked husband caters to their whims. As the women grow more boisterous and uncontrolled, the timid man, wearing a ridiculous little apron, bounces obediently from one thankless chore to another. He tries vainly to end the drinking bout by substituting tea and sandwiches for the vodka bottle, but the 4 women snap at him about the food, bitch about the dirty table, and clutch at the vodka. When they finally break up for the night, they reel around the stage in helpless inebriation, while the woebegone husband strives to jam them into their coats and ferry them out the door. With the others gone, he begins helping his own wife to bed by pulling off her shoes, but she pinches him on the butt. "Don't touch me," he squeaks, and they launch into a spat over whose paycheck was frittered away on vodka. Russian audiences find it all deliciously funny. They love slapstick, and they immediately understand the parody as a complete reversal of typical roles of Russian households, where the wife does the chores while the husband lounges about reading the paper, watching television, or getting drunk with friends. Not long before I left for Moscow, an American woman of Russian descent gave me a couple of booklets of Russian proverbs. I was surprised at the blatant male chauvinism in a number of them. A wife isn't a jug. She won't crack if you hit her a few. When you take an eel by its tail or a woman by her word, there's precious little stays in your hands. Or a dog is wiser than a woman. He won't bark at his master. Working-class women nowadays still take rough drinking and rough handling from their menfolk very much for granted. A Western diplomat's wife told me how her Russian maid had questioned her about her husband, and after discovering that he did not periodically get drunk and beat up his wife, pronounced her very Russian verdict: he must not be much of a man. These are inbred attitudes drawn basically from peasant life, as was the most embarrassingly candid joke about male superiority that I heard in Russia. Intriguingly, it was told by a young man, well-educated, married, and an urbanite. According to him, it is an apt caricature of male Russian attitudes. It is one of those jokes about testing the national character of Spaniards, Frenchmen, Englishmen, and Russians by putting two men and a woman from each nationality on a series of desert islands. The scientist left them for several months, and when he returned to the island where he had deposited the Spanish trio, he found the woman alone and asked about the men. "Oh, they have shot each other, dueling over me," she said in disgust. At the English island, the three people were standing in the same separate corners where they had been left. When the scientist asked why, one of the men replied, "You forgot to introduce us properly." At the French island, things were in perfect order, and one man was tending a well-manicured garden. How had it been so well organized, and where was the other couple? The scientist inquired. Simple, explained the gardening Frenchman. For 3 months he was her lover. For 3 months I was. Now it is his turn again, and they are off somewhere while I do the gardening. Finally, at the Russian island, the scientist came upon the two men holding a meeting, seated at a green felt-topped table, drinking bottled Narzan, soda water, and making boring speeches to each other. "Where is the woman?" the scientist asked. "The masses," declared one man with masculine condescension, "are in the fields working." Among educated people, such attitudes are more muted. In some families we know, the wife was more assertive than the husband, and as my experience with Maria Fyodorovna showed, career women are occasionally more outspoken and self-confident than men. But in my experience, these were not the typical cases. In Russia, as in the West, women generally defer to men, wait on them, play a more retiring role, and complain that male officialdom treats women less seriously than men. On occasion, I have seen educated men treat serious matters as not for the wives, much as stuffy European diplomats cling to their segregated after-dinner cigars. Once I asked a dissident who was campaigning for human rights why more women did not sign dissident statements. "If women signed those statements, people would laugh at it," he said. "You don't understand that we still live in the Middle Ages." Another time, I was talking with two young establishment husbands about Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which they had surreptitiously read and found impressive and devastating. Yet when I asked one of their wives her opinion, she shrugged helplessly. "Oh, we don't give those books to our wives, we just read them ourselves," her husband hastily explained, oblivious to the slur on her intellect. In fairness, he represented only part of the story, for we knew other couples where husband and wife shared their intellectual life fully and equally. Moreover, in most Russian families, the women take such complete responsibility for managing the household that husbands simply turn over their paychecks to their wives as a matter of course and leave the rest to them. In Estonia, a Russian bank cashier told me she was having trouble with her Estonian husband because in typical Estonian tradition, he wanted to control the family budget, whereas she wanted to follow the Russian custom of the woman managing the finances. This young lady mentioned several other mixed Estonian-Russian couples with similar problems. In some cases, she said, the ethnic frictions ended in divorce. Ordinary Russians women take it for granted that they are the binding force in the family, and sometimes laugh at the helplessness of their husbands. My husband can go out and buy the bread or milk, simple things like that. A waitress in an airport restaurant told me with a twinkle, but I can't trust him with anything bigger. If we wanted to buy something really big like furniture, we'd save money and decide on it together. Otherwise, I buy everything, even his clothes. I always go with him. If I didn't, he'd come home with a terrible junk. Her assumption of responsibility is shared by most Russian wives, though in practice it is limited to the chore of keeping the household afloat and functioning and minding the children. The man is the real head of the household. I recall one leading Russian journalist back in Moscow after a visit to the United States, unhappily contending that American men are under the thumbs of their wives. When I asked him why he felt this way, he told me about an evening we had spent at the home of a well-known Washington journalist. He was busy all the time fixing drinks, cooking steaks, and I fell under the power of his wife, the Russian complained. The whole evening I had to listen to his wife's talk about clothes, children, prices, shopping, women's talk. It was awful. I hardly had a word with the poor man. If that is your women's liberation, I hope we don't get it here. What appalled him was not only that this American woman was boring, but that her husband had accepted such a subservient role. As Maria Fyodorovna's experience suggests, the male vacuum of the immediate post-war period drew millions of women into the economy and was the springboard toward success for some of today's middle-aged women. Women now account for nearly one-fourth of the Soviet equivalent of PhDs, close to one-third of the ordinary judges, nearly one-third of the 1,500 members of the Supreme Soviet Parliament, about 70% of the doctors, and about 15,000 members of the professional unions of journalists, writers, artists, architects, composers, and film workers. More than 5 million women have had some higher education, not too much of a lag behind men. In part, this is a result of the lopsided feminine majority in the population after the war, yet even as a peacetime birth rates have begun to even out the Soviet population and build up the male share, the government has kept up intensive recruiting to draw every possible woman out of the household and into the labor force. Women are actually a larger portion of the workforce today than in 1950. During the 1960s, more than 16 million additional women were put in jobs, a staggering figure. Even though the rate of growth slowed in the 70s as the reservoir of unemployed women was depleted, roughly 60 million women were at work in 74, close to 85% of all working-age women, the highest percentage in the industrialized world. In America, the figure was just about 50%. Most Soviet women by now take a job as part of the natural order of things, and find it hard to imagine not working. So strongly ingrained in them is the work ethic that there is a stigma to being simply a housewife. The weight of propaganda steadily emphasizes the duty to work. One movie, Let's Live Till Monday, for example, showed a teacher publicly criticizing a 10th grade girl for answering a free essay question, "What do you want to be?" by saying her dream was to become a mother with many children. The teacher castigated this as a shameful response. For many Soviet women, the traditional American woman's role of homemaker, mother, raiser of children does not seem adequate. They feel unfulfilled without a job. Even some whom I heard complain bitterly about having too much to do said in the next breath that they reluctantly preferred the exhaustion of too many burdens to the spiritual death. As one young teacher put it, of being unemployed, bored, and idle at home. But this is more than the urge to work. It is a matter of total lifestyle. For not only is Soviet society geared to get women into jobs, but home life, especially in the cities, has much less to offer than in the West. Apartments are small and confining. Few urban couples have more than one child. Most sports and other leisure hobbies are a luxury. Russian women have no parallel for the range of volunteer and community activities or adult education enjoyed for their own sake, which absorb so much of the time and energy of non-working American wives. Only at work can most women have a life of their own. Don't American women want to get out of the house? Zoya, a 30-year-old in Tourist Guide, asked incredulously when Anne mentioned that she had given up her teaching job to become a mother full-time. Zoya may have been a bit unusual, for she admitted that she had no taste for child rearing. Most Russian women dote on children. She had turned over her own baby at 3 months to her mother-in-law, a classic babushka grandmother who lived with the family. So Zoya was unsatisfied by Anne's explanation that raising 4 children as we moved from one foreign assignment to another kept her busy. "Don't you want to go to work?" she demanded. "Don't you want to earn money and get some independence?" That feeling of financial independence is an asset prized by younger, educated women especially. An attractive chestnut-haired divorcee with a 9-year-old son told me that having a career had been essential to her daring to seek divorce. Without a separate income, she said, she would not have been able to raise her son on alimony, which for one child is usually 1/4 of the husband's salary. "You don't have to listen to some man talk to you that way if you have your own job," she asserted. "Others simply enjoy the social life provided by working companions. Many an institute, factory, or enterprise will organize group excursions, theater trips, nature outings, and picnics, not just once a year, holidays, parties like those in American offices, but more frequent occasions where the working woman can enjoy her time off apart from her family if she chooses. Yet for all this, it is basically the economic imperatives, both for the government and the individual, which really leave the Soviet women no alternative but to work. Most of the daycare centers and other supporting institutions which Soviet propagandists so constantly ascribe to the state's benign solicitude for feminine liberation are actually indispensable requirements for keeping as many women as possible on the job. Several Russian women commented rather bitterly that the network of state nurseries, kindergartens, and child summer camps were less to aid their self-fulfillment than the fulfillment of production norms at the factory. Indeed, Western economists have noted that a fair share of the Soviet economic growth over the past 15 years has increasing the size of the labor force, especially by getting more women and pensioners to work. On a personal level, few Soviet families could enjoy the luxury of having only one parent at work. Most fathers earned too little. Average factory workers' pay in '74 was $187 monthly to support a family of 3, let alone 4 or more. One of the most persistent reactions to American life that I encountered among Russians was their surprise that large numbers of American families could be supported by the father alone. Even middle-class Russians, who were my counterparts in Soviet society, were incredulous that in a family of 6, my wife did not have to work to contribute to the family budget. Finances in Russian families with children are often so touch and go, even with both parents working, that some women do not even use all the unpaid maternity leave to which they are legally entitled, because their families cannot afford to live on the husband's salary alone. I knew one couple where the husband, a government worker, made a good salary of about $350 a month, yet his wife went back to work after only 9 months maternity leave because they felt a financial squeeze. For the overwhelming majority of urban women, the practical choice of not working simply does not exist. One irony is that these financial imperatives have created a strong undertow of what might be called a counter-lib feeling among some educated Soviet women. In my experience, the same well-educated, rather well-heeled segment of society, which in America has furnished some of the most vigorous and active women's livers, for whom a career is the panacea, where the Americans are rebelling outwardly against having to be housewives, the Russians are rebelling inwardly against having to be breadwinners, a necessity that can transform work from a means of self-fulfillment and independence into drudgery. I have heard quite a few educated Russian women voice resentment at having to work. A literary critic in her 60s said that 3 of her 4 grown daughters, all with higher education, would much prefer not to work. A mother of 3 related to a famous poet and financially well enough off not to have to work mentioned the envy of her friends at her freedom from work. Others said privately that they would prefer part-time jobs. In the Soviet system, where flexible enough to allow that, and occasionally the idea surfaces briefly in the press, but it never gets seriously developed, because it obviously goes counter to what the authorities want. I remember the wry reaction of one veteran woman editor, whose years in publishing houses and on newspapers had left her with perennially weary eyes. When I asked her reaction to American-style women's lib, "Away with your emancipation," she retorted. After the revolution, when they emancipated women, it meant that women could do the same heavy work as men, but many women prefer not to work but to stay at home and raise their children. I have 1 child, but I wanted more. But who can afford more children? Unfortunately, we cannot work because the pay our husbands earn is not enough to live on. So we have to go every day and make money. In their careers, many Soviet women complain of discrimination just as vehemently as Western women. Superficially, this may seem surprising because women are so visible in Soviet public life. For Soviet politicians are just as sensitive to a show of ticket balancing as American politicians are, and usually arrange to have women's representatives or women's delegates prominently placed at any public occasion. Propagandists never tire of boasting about Soviet women in figurehead positions, disregarding the reality that men really run things. The press, for example, brags frequently that more women sit in the Supreme Soviet than in all the parliaments of the capitalist states combined, but this is a spurious comparison. The Supreme Soviet is for show, a sweetener for women or minority nationalities that often misleads foreigners. It is a rubber-stamped body that has unanimously approved every single measure put to it. Within the Communist Party, the real apparatus of power, Soviet women have fared no better and probably not as well as American women in the political life of their country. Not one of the 15 members of the ruling Politburo, which makes all the key decisions, is a woman, nor is there any woman among the 9 national secretaries in the party secretariat, which runs the day-to-day operations of the party. Half a dozen women are members of the powerful 241-member Party Central Committee, a proportion slightly smaller than the number of women in Congress, though a couple of these women were token representatives of labor rather than people of real power, as most Central Committee members are. Like America, the Soviet Union has notably lagged behind countries such as India, Israel, Ceylon, or Great Britain, which have put women at the head of their governments or a major political party. In roughly 6 decades of Soviet power, the one woman who made it into the Politburo was Yekaterina Furtaseva, a favorite of Khrushchev, who was soon demoted but served from 60 until she died in 74 as the only woman in the Soviet cabinet. Even at republic and provincial levels, almost no woman has risen above positions of command, has risen to positions of command. America may have had only 4 woman governors, but no women have had comparable posts of power as party bosses of a republic or a major province. Occasionally in Russia, as in the West, the inbred unself-conscious male chauvinism comes out in the embarrassing ways, but none during my tour topped the official announcement of the Soviet Commission for International Women's Year in '75, headed by a man. In the economy, the picture for women is better, but not a great deal. Khrushchev, in a candid observation to a large meeting of agricultural supervisors, is supposed to have surveyed the scene and remarked, disapprovingly, that it turns out that it is the men who do the administering and the women who do the work. Women do comprise roughly half the workforce in the industry, yet 9 out of 10 plant managers are men. Women represent nearly half of those engaged in scientific work, but only 10% of the senior professors or members of the Academy of Sciences. Close to 3/4 of Soviet school teachers are women, but 3/4 of the principals in the basic 8 and 10 grade schools are men. About 70% of the doctors are women, but men get the lion's share of the prestigious jobs as top surgeons, department supervisors, or hospital directors. Those figures may not compare too unfavorably with the West, but given the numbers of women in the Russian workforce, they do undercut the contention that Moscow is far ahead in granting women equality. In Russia, equal pay for equal work is an accepted principle, but getting the equal work is the problem. Millions of women are shunted into lower-paying, less prestigious fields. Teaching and medicine are prime examples. These are practically at the bottom of the pay and status scales, and these are the professions in which women are most heavily represented. In industry, women work most in the light consumer sector, where, according to Soviet studies, pay and all other benefits are well below those in heavy industry, where men predominate. In farming, women provide the core of the low-paid, unskilled field hands, while men operate the machinery and get better pay. Perhaps most indicative of the situation nationwide, one major Soviet economic study drafting a working-class family budget assumed that the husband would earn 50% more than his wife. When women do break into more desirable careers, they often complain of a double standard. I used to work in a design bureau with about 10 architects, all women, but the chief of our section was a man. An articulate lady architect in her mid-30s told me. He was a very mediocre architect, and everyone knew it, except him. Some of the women were mediocre, too, but some were quite talented. One of the talented ones should have been the selection chief on the basis of merit alone. There was a lot of resentment against the man who was conservative, not very bright, and who would reject projects with unusual ideas. It was impossible to argue with him. He would say, "Oh, you are just a bunch of women with silly ideas." And if you argued that sex had nothing to do with designs, he would say that he had to clear the drafts with his superiors, and they were all men. so he would insist that we do it over again. It was frustrating. Women don't like that sort of thing, chimed in a slender blonde artist who had been listening. But we have to accept it. What can we do about it? It is always said that men can take a more serious attitude toward their jobs than women because they do not have the distractions of children and housework and no interruptions for childbirth. Men are simply regarded as superior. What bothered her equally was that the double standards applied to private life as well. A man can fool around with other women, drink, even be lackadaisical toward his job, and this is generally forgiven. But if a woman does the same things, she is criticized for taking a light-hearted attitude toward her marriage and her work. To American feminists, this comment may sound like a frustrating replay of their own problems, yet there are some crucial differences between the predicament of Russian women and American women. For example, Soviet women already comprise a much larger proportion of the workforce than elsewhere, that the most talented ones feel that women have earned a larger share of supervisory jobs. Nonetheless, Soviet women lack a real public outlet to campaign for better treatment, while their problems do constitute one of the few areas discussed with some candor in the Soviet press. The censors obviously consider blunt charges of sex discrimination on the job taboo. Only veiled hints or occasional mention of outlandish cases get through so that improvements depend largely on masculine goodwill rather than the vigorous public pressures, political action, or court cases that Western women can use as leverage. Moreover, as a schoolteacher commented to me bitterly, in Russia, women do the dog's work, the grubby, low-paying work that in America is consigned to blacks and wetbacks. Indeed, most Western tourists arriving in Russia for the first time are forcibly struck by Russian women cracking asphalt on the highways and hefting shovelfuls into trucks, while the male truck driver watches, using crowbars to pry loose old railroad ties, sweeping streets or shoveling snow and cracking ice in winter, carrying wood, hoeing potato fields, slapping paint on buildings in the coldest weather, or heaving coal into trains along the Trans-Siberian Railroad. How can one fail to feel shame and compassion at the sight of our women carrying heavy barrows of stones for paving the street? Alexander Solzhenitsyn asked in his open letter to the leadership before he was exiled. Some Soviet officials privately share the embarrassment of having women work like beasts of burden, but many Russians are not shocked by it because it has been so long part of the scene. Finally, the financial imperative to work and the chaotic inefficiency of consumer life puts the working Russian woman in a crucible that very few American women experience, and the Soviet welfare programs only partially relieve. Soviet women find themselves inescapably mortgaged to two worlds, work and family. Unable to succeed in either, they are left to race, as one Soviet writer put it, like squirrels in a cage. This predicament is not unknown in the West, of course, but in Russia it is the norm. In the words of one joke that a Moscow friend told to me, under capitalism, women are not liberated because they have no opportunity to work. They have to stay at home, go shopping, do the cooking, keep house, and take care of the children. But under socialism, women are liberated. They have the opportunity to work all day and then go home, do the shopping, do the cooking, keep house, and take care of the children. Several times when I asked Soviet friends about their lives as liberated professional women, They recommended that I read a story called 1 Week Like Any Other by Natalia Baranskaya and published by the magazine New World in '69 under the liberal editorship of Alexander Tavarsky, written in the matter-of-fact prose of a weekly diary. It immediately touched off controversy because it so directly challenged the official slogan image of the new Soviet woman proudly and happily serving as a good mother and a good production worker. It is now out of print, but was more daring than what was permissible in the early '70s. Olga, the heroine, is caught in the dilemma of trying to hold a full-time job in a scientific institute, keeping up with new developments in her field, and trying to raise 2 small children, without help from a live-in grandmother, and precious little assistance from her husband, who is also a scientist. She is always late, always racing to catch up, always tired and uncombed, almost never able to find a moment to herself, and afraid of losing her job. It is, as she says, a life of eternal haste, permanent anxiety, fear. As her work week begins, Monday morning, she and her woman co-workers find a questionnaire asking how they allot their time. Among the headings is leisure. Ach, leisure, it's a rather awkward word, she muses to herself, and then satirizing official slogans, she thinks on. Women struggle for cultural leisure. It is something alien, leisure. Personally, I am attracted to sports, to running. I run here, I run there, with bundles in each arm. I run up, I run down, into the tram, into the bus, into the subway and out. We don't have any stores in our district. We have been living there more than a year, but still they are not built. So Olga shops downtown and lugs home her groceries daily, fighting with the bus and subway crowds. At the office, someone turns up with 2 spare theater tickets, but she must turn them down because there is no one to care for the children, except for grandmothers and grandfathers. Soviet society does not have evening babysitters. Russian Moors don't permit children to work for money. American women with small children would recognize Olga's recitation of the rat race of cooking, mending, tending, changing, washing, scrubbing, soaping, sweeping, vacuuming, and falling into bed at midnight exhausted, only to wake in the wee hours to comfort a sick child, and then drag herself weary from bed in the morning. But some things Soviet readers take for granted, Americans would overlook. Diapers, as our one Russian mother advised me. There are no diaper services, no buyable disposable diapers, no rubber panties, so that each diaper must be immediately changed, washed, rinsed, and hung up to dry on the radiator or makeshift line in the bathroom. Soviet industry has not yet produced a clothes dryer. Washing itself is a nightmare. I knew one woman who, like many others, still did it by hand in old zinc tubs, sometimes in cold water, in an old building that had no running hot water. But most women in big cities now have small Soviet washers. They are called semi-automatic, but they take constant attention and manual operation. Put in the clothes, turn on the tap to run the water, turn off the tap, push pre-wash button, come back in a few minutes, turn off the machine, set the switch to drain, wait while it does a feeble spin dry, pour in fresh water, and so on. On some models, rinsing requires lifting out the clothes and doing the rinse by hand in the sink. Soviet models do 3 to 4 pounds per wash compared to 14 or 15 for American models, so that a small laundry can take all morning. Dishwashers are unknown. Refrigerators either come without freezer sections or they are so small that frozen TV dinners are out. They do not exist anyway. Pre-cooked or ready-to-cook meals are almost non-existent, though some restaurants have carry-out service. Mostly women cook meals from scratch. That makes for a plain diet. Olga, for example, serves eggs, cheese, sausage, potatoes, or buckwheat porridge at night. In the middle of the week, over sandwiches at the office, she and her co-workers fall to discussing another point on the questionnaire. Why don't Russian women have more children? And do women have children for personal reasons or in the public interest? A question that reflects the official drive to promote larger families, especially among ethnic Russians, because the leadership is worried about Russians being outnumbered by more prolific ethnic minority groups. Olga raises her hand to speak, and sarcastically mocking the stilted rhetoric of Soviet propaganda, campaigns to stimulate socialist competition, she declaims, "Comrades, permit a multi-childed mother to have a word." I assure you that I gave birth to 2 children exclusively for state considerations. I challenge you to a competition, and I hope that you defeat me both in quantity and quality of products. An empty argument boils on in the same sterile language, while Olga privately recalls how she dreaded her second child. Katik, her son, was only 18 months old when she discovered she was pregnant again. I felt horrid. I wept. I signed up for an abortion, she remembers, but I didn't feel entirely in favor of it. A sympathetic doctor coaxed her out of abortion by encouraging her to hope for a daughter. Her husband, Dima, wanted the abortion, but he relented and took a second job when she quit work to give birth and nurse the baby. One of the more unusual passages is the open criticism by both husband and wife of the much vaunted Soviet nurseries for 1 to 3-year-olds. They complain that 28 children in one group is too many for one upbringer to handle. They are disturbed that their little daughter misses Olga so much that she clings desperately to her at night and resists going to the nursery in the morning, and they are upset that their children so frequently get sick from other youngsters. In all, Olga has missed 76 days, nearly 1/3 of her working time, in the past year for children's sick leave. But fearing the consequences of missing yet another day, she takes her daughter to the nursery one morning despite a night of vomiting. Yet so essential is a job to Olga's self-esteem that she reacts in fury at Dima's suggestion that she quit work for a few years to concentrate on raising the children. "Do you want to destroy me?" she shrieks in tears. Olga's work week is not entirely without bright moments. A brief period in the library reading international scientific journals and leafing through other foreign magazines. A small triumph when an under-the-table tip gets her a cute haircut after the regular hairdresser carelessly leaves her face looking like an equilateral triangle. An impulsive walk part way home to enjoy nature, sledding with the children and her husband between chores on Sunday. But the marital frictions are unrelenting, though Olga describes Dima as a good husband compared to others. He helps with the dishes, does some shopping, watches the children part-time on the weekend, and occasionally helps dress them. But Olga resents every moment he sits sipping tea and reading professional journals in the evening while she does housework. On Sunday night, after failing all week to find time to sew one button back onto her dress, she explodes when Dima asks her to iron his pants. Sunday night, she falls into bed, overcome by life. "I'm really lost in a blind alley of chores and cares." To an outsider, the portrait may seem overdrawn, but several women told me they were real life. Olgas, and I am confident that the Olgas far outnumber the success stories like Maria Fyodorovna. The frequently published complaint of Soviet mothers about their household burdens and the rasping replies of husbands who refused to be goaded into doing more household chores were further confirmation that Olga's story reflected central tensions in many Russian families. The high divorce rate, about 28% in '74, compared to 43% in America, though in Moscow it is said to be about 50%, is further evidence of the strains of modern urban life, intensified by pressures on working women and the housing squeeze which allows individuals little privacy. Nonetheless, Olga's story was untypical in three respects. Unlike most Russian urban women, she had a second child. She was lucky to get places for both children in daycare centers, something only about one-half of urban families can do because there are not enough places for all. In rural areas, only about one-fourth of the children can be handled, but she had no babushka or grandmother living in to care for the children when she was unhappy with the daycare centers. Although lifestyles are changing under the pressure of urbanization, the tradition of the extended family, where 3 generations from infants to babushkas or dedushkas, grandfathers, live all together, is still a strong Russian institution. Babysitters are built in. To me, one of the most attractive features of Russian life is the strength of family feelings and the deeply felt sense of responsibility from generation to generation. Indeed, so well known are the strong family ties that I was surprised to learn about the high divorce rate and the widespread practice of taking separate vacations. Children off to a pioneer camp, and husband and wife going their separate ways at separate times. Partly this is because husbands and wives find it impossible to arrange simultaneous vacations, though a number of Russian men told me they preferred it that way. As one Soviet diplomat smilingly explained, it was not a vacation if his wife went along, but in normal day-to-day living, the family is of necessity very close. A babushka may add to the crowding and squabbling in the family apartment, but she is an indispensable aid to the working mother, and very few families willingly get along without her. This recompense to the elderly is that in a society which has the reputation for cradle-to-the-grave welfare, but which, from what I heard, has only a limited and not very attractive institutional system for caring for the aged, families care for their own elderly at home. Thus, paradoxically, at both ends of life, in childhood and old age, the system's deficiencies are strengthening the importance of the family. The greatest tragedy for most urban Russian women, to hear them tell it, is that they feel forced by circumstances to forego the pleasures of having more than one child. Children are the greatest riches in the world, and we have been deprived of them because people cannot afford them, sadly mused a grandmother whose own grown son was an outstanding computer specialist. A dark-eyed woman, a writer, offered the bitter epigram that Soviet women have been put into production and taken out of reproduction. Literally, dozens of other women, upon discovering that we had 4 children, would blossom with smiles and exclaim, "You are rich people," meaning not wealthy but blessed. Very many women would dream of having 2 or 3 children, not just one, a woman journalist commented, but that happens mainly in the countryside or in Central Asia. There isn't enough money, enough space, the right conditions for most people to have more than one child if they live in the city. We had one, and that was all I could manage, and if you hear of someone with 2 children, it is some kind of heroism. This sense of deprivation comes out not only in random conversations. Literary Gazette in 1973 published a survey of 33,000 women, which concluded that the vast majority of women want 2 or 3 times as many children as they actually have. Another survey reported that only 3% of women thought 1 child was ideal, yet 64% had only 1 child, and 17% had none. The state has tried to encourage larger families with all kinds of propaganda, including publicity about mother heroines with 10 children. Small taxes are imposed on bachelors and childless couples, and allowances of a few rubles monthly are paid to women with 3 or more children. In November of '74, the government instituted a new child support allowance of $15 monthly to families where monthly income fell below $67 per person to help large families, but this seems too modest a measure in itself to stimulate bigger families and stem the steady decline of the Soviet birth rate. The natural population growth is now one of the world's lowest, less than 1% annually. A worrisome fact to a political leadership that regards large population as one element of national power. For all their emotional attachment to children, many Russian women dread childbirth, from what some told Anne and me. This is partly because little pain-killing anesthesia is used, but probably more fundamentally because of the archaic Soviet attitudes toward sex education and general preparation for birth. Western preoccupation with sex and sexual problems is matched by almost total silence in Russia. The one so-called sex manual that appeared during my time in Moscow turned out to be mainly a discussion of abnormal cases and of little use to ordinary people. Privately, Russians have a lively, earthly approach to sex in the flesh, whether on university campuses, in writers' homes, or in any other mixed group setting that lends itself to promiscuity. Privately, they relish dirty jokes and gossip about other people's infidelities, but in public they have a Victorian squeamishness about candid discussion of the biology of sex, and in public can mean just 2 people. Not only did I hear Western students express astonishment at the prudery and biological naive of young Russians, but periodically the Soviet press ran some pathetic lament from a pregnant teenage girl pleading for frank advice because her mother literally dropped her knitting when she mentioned the subject of sex. Still, the advice is not forthcoming, except in the form of wary warnings that men are wicked, vulgar language is naughty, and chastity should not be surrendered lightly. So total is the sexual puritanism of Soviet public life, so much at odds with the free love, sex is a drink of water, avant-gardism of the early Bolshevik years, that sitting in Moscow I could hardly help but be amused by alarms in America that sex education in American schools was a communist plot. One practical impact of Soviet Puritanism is that birth control winds up being more a matter of reacting after pregnancy than of planned prevention. To begin with, the arsenal of birth control methods and information about them is limited. Dr. Yuri Blashansky, the silver-haired chief gynecologist of Moscow, told me that 5 sizes of diaphragms are available to women, but my Russian women friends said they could find only 2 and that without jelly or cream, these were pretty useless. The supply of birth control pills, mainly a Hungarian variety known as Infecundin, was so limited and erratic that many young women dared not start for fear of running out at the wrong time. Those who had tried Soviet varieties complained of bad side effects, liver and blood problems, and doctors at one maternity home which I visited confirmed this as a serious problem. Soviet condoms are so thick and clumsy that they destroy all sexual pleasure, and men told me they refused to use them. The loop late in catching on is coming into wider use. I was told most couples use rhythm or practice withdrawal. Not too surprisingly then, when one American woman asked relatives in Russia what gifts they would most appreciate, they said contraceptives. For the main method of birth control is abortion. Re-legalized in 1955 after Stalin had it outlawed in the 1930s. Officially, an abortion cost nothing for a working woman, and only 5 rubles for a woman who does not work, though several people told me that women or girls pay 30 to 40 rubles or more to get a private abortion if they want it hushed up or want to get into a good clinic and have nice treatment. Nominally, the Soviet medical establishment frowns on abortions. We do not consider abortion a good method of birth control, Dr. Blashonsky said. We prefer other methods, the pill, the loop, diaphragms, condoms, rhythm. But if a woman wants an abortion during her first 3 months of pregnancy, that is her choice. After that, she can have an abortion only for medical reasons. As with so many other fields, the Soviets do not publish abortion statistics, and have not done so for years. For each birth, we figure 2 abortions, Dr. Blashonsky said. In Moscow, we have almost the same statistics as New York, about 200,000 abortions in 1973. That includes both abortions and miscarriages. Abortions are about 85%, or 170,000. If that were typical nationwide, it would mean roughly 5 million abortions annually, a staggering figure, but one that cannot be confirmed. What was clear to me, however, was that many women have repeated abortions. Having 2 or 3 is common. Nurses in Moscow and provincial hospitals spoke of women having 4, 5, 6, and I heard higher figures too. Soviet doctors, though they try to discourage abortions, say that medically there is no limit to the number that one woman can endure, so long as she is in good health and there is at least a 6-month interval between abortions. The official explanation from officials like Dr. Blashonsky is that all are done with light anesthesia, and by the modern vacuum suction method, as may be the case in the best hospitals. But women who have been through more ordinary gynecological hospitals complain of unsanitary, overcrowded, and unpleasant conditions and say the old scraping method is used. It's like an assembly line, very crowded, and you hear the others being sick and nurses shouting at them. One pretty young married woman recalled, "The atmosphere is traumatic, and any kind of gynecological care is so unpleasant, even at a gynecologist's office, that any woman puts off going as long as possible. I found having an abortion a very unpleasant experience, nor were her feelings unique." More than one Moscow husband joked that the primary method of birth control were the housing shortage, the total lack of double beds in the Soviet Union, and the exhaustion of their working wives. The married Russian woman who already has a child has no time for sex, groused one frustrated middle-aged husband. By the time she's finished doing everything else, she's too tired for sex. His wife agreed, and that is obviously a common feeling, for I remember an audience at the Moscow Art Theater getting a great kick from a line in Chekhov's Seagull, when Masha, an unhappy young woman, leeringly comments, When I marry, there will be no time left for love. And with that, the way she said love, the audience took it physically. Some women privately retort to the complaints of their husbands that the way Russian men make love, the women do not get much sexual satisfaction anyway. There is no question of being satisfied sexually, said one woman, an unusually candid Jewish writer. That is why it is not discussed. It is considered shameful to discuss. It's no problem for them, but for us. She said a doctor had told her of women who were afraid to reach climax because they feared it might increase chances of becoming pregnant. The writer's husband, a scientist, tacitly agreed with her assessment of the lovemaking of Russian men, for who he told me that on travels to the Caucasus he had heard the dark-haired, dark-eyed Georgians, known as a race of Romeos, boasting that Russian women liked to sleep with them because they paid more attention to the pleasures of foreplay than Russian men, who have a reputation for a slam-bam, thank you ma'am approach to sex. Nonetheless, Soviet demographers report that extramarital and premarital sex is on the rise in many age groups, so much so that one study published in Our Contemporary magazine in June 1975 disclosed that 1 out of 10 children is illegitimate, or about 400,000 every year. Childbirth in Russia is very different from in America. Some women, but not a lot, take natural childbirth courses. They are told to breathe deeply because oxygen helps relieve pain, and except for Novocaine, anesthesia is not often used. In theory, women go to their local district maternity home, but in big cities, many prospective parents shop around to find the maternity hospital with the best reputations. One couple in Leningrad told me they blamed poor medical practices for the loss of a first child, a breech birth, and they carefully researched several others before picking the best maternity hospital in the city for the second birth. There, as elsewhere, the wife was kept for more than a week. Soviet doctors who hold new mothers for 8 to 10 days are shocked that American women are allowed to leave the maternity hospital in 3 to 4 days. Another Soviet practice is to keep husbands and other relatives segregated from mothers and new babies. They are not allowed to enter the hospital except to bring needed items from home, and nurses are strict about what is allowed. Hair curlers are absoluted forbidden. I don't know why Viktor Grebenshikov, one of our office translators, told me just after the birth of his daughter, and the nurses seem to have an uncanny way of spotting hair curlers, no matter how they are hidden in packages. Only new books are accepted. Old books are rejected. Perhaps it is dust. The hospital food is pretty dull, so the women all want food, cookies or chocolates, cheese and sausage, but the nurses have a list of what is permitted and what is not. It doesn't matter because we have a system for getting around all these restrictions. The relatives all gather outside the windows of the maternity wards, and the women lower down strings. We tie things onto the strings to be hoisted up. It is a marvelous scene. Fathers and brothers and grandfathers all happy and delighted, passing up little bundles on the strings. Unfortunately, my wife is in a room on the 3rd floor directly over the nurse's room. Before we can tie on any packages, our group of fathers has to make sure that the nurses are not there. So we have some volunteer go to the message room for official transfer of messages to mothers to make sure the nurses are busy down the corridor. Then hurriedly everyone ties the packages on the strings, and the mothers are shouting down at us from the 3rd floor and relatives shouting up answers. Everyone is in a good mood. The strings are left behind by each group of mothers as they leave for the next group. It is a quintessential Russian scene, an unnecessarily complex set of rules laid down by hospital authorities, ordinary Russians engineering ways to beat the system, and the nurses probably fully aware of what was going on, simply blinking at the practice. To the foreigner, it is touching, amusing, but a bit bizarre that people have to go to so much trouble. To Russians, it is perfectly natural. That is the way so much of life operates, and they take special delight in their small private victories. The rules carry over into the early days and weeks of parenthood. In maternity hospitals, mothers have to wait 24 hours to see their babies, who are very tightly swaddled, legs, bodies, and arms in the traditional Russian kosinka, a mummy-like wrapping. The freedom of movement given American babies is not permitted. If hands are left free, a Russian nurse told me, babies will scratch their eyes and cheeks. Legs must be held out straight. Only the little round head peeps out from the kosinka. Russian babies are always laid out on their backs. Victor, our translator, voiced the Russian belief that babies laid on their stomachs would suffocate, and was skeptical when we mentioned that millions of Americans had begun life on their stomachs. Most Russian babies are nursed, often up to a year. Doctors and mothers believe in the natural way. Besides, practically no ingredients for bottle formula are sold. Many urban Russian parents regard the instructions of the local nurse or pediatrician as law. The Soviet market cries out for books like those by Spock and Gazelle. Soviet counterparts are too stuffy and formalistic to be of much practical use. A young Russian mother told me Spock was her favorite, and evidently for many others because the translation sold out long ago. Despite the impression in the West that Soviet children are almost automatically turned over to well-subsidized state nurseries right from the cradle, it came as a discovery to me that most preschool children are actually raised at home. The main reason is that although subsidies put the cost of daycare centers as low as $14 a month to the parents, the state had enough spaces in '74 for only about 1/3 of the 30 million preschool children from ages 1 to 6. The older 3 to 6 group is better covered than the 1 to 3 group. Cities are about twice as well served as rural areas, though city women frequently have to hunt for spaces and occasionally protest to the press about long cross-town bus rides to distant and inconvenient nurseries. At kindergarten nursery number 104 in southwest Moscow, Zoya Listener, a cheerful blonde mother and Communist Party member, told me how she had reluctantly surrendered a good $265 a month job at Lekhachev automobile plant, one of the high prestige plants of the country where her son was born. She could not put up with the crosstown work and nursery runs and decided to raise her son at home for the first 3 years. Eventually, she was able to place him in the local kindergarten by taking $100 a month job there herself as a nanny. I found her case significant because it reflected not only the shortage of space in nurseries but also on the preference of a fair number of women, and the better educated the higher the proportion, for bringing up children at home rather than turning them over to nurseries. Most Soviet mothers are enthusiastic about kindergarten play schools for 3 to 6-year-olds. Blue-collar mothers often have no choice but to use the 1 to 3-year-old nurseries to protect their factory jobs. But apparently a growing number of urban women, especially professional women who can sometimes arrange part-time work, dislike using nurseries and make great efforts to avoid them. The children can learn from grandmother, and they are better off with her, said a lady lawyer. Nor is this merely the reaction of mothers. From time to time, respected Soviet scholars voice misgivings about group upbringing during the first 3 years. In September '74, the noted demographer Viktor Peredvintsev wrote in the Monthly Journalist that negative aspects of nurseries are becoming more clear. a lag in education compared with family-raised children, and a greater rate of sickness. He recommended cutting back on nurseries and using part of the funds saved for expanding kindergartens rapidly for the older group, as well as paying mothers an allowance to enable them to raise children of nursery school age by themselves. This would involve a major break with the state's policy on working mothers and a significant revamping of the daycare center system. Hence, the surprise in some quarters that Prevedentev's critique appeared, though it was only a few sentences buried at the end of a long article extolling the Soviet social welfare system. But Prevedentsev said other demographers shared his views, and the fact that his article appeared in the organ of the Journalist Union suggested backing from some fairly powerful people in the press, and perhaps in the government or party. These proposals let mothers raise their own children in the early years, and to give them some financial allowance for doing so, are privately welcomed by many professional women. Probably the most moving appeal for turning child-rearing back to mothers has come from Arkady Raikin, the stage comic, who often ends his programs with a touching monologue on motherhood. It is about Slavik, a small boy, whose grandmother has died and whose mother has more than she can handle with her job, her shopping, her son, and her housework, because she cannot always be handy when the boy needs her. She asks neighbors to help. On the way to work, she calls on a pensioner in a nearby apartment to see that the boy gets up in time for school. She asks a nurse to feel his forehead on the way home from school to make sure he is well. She asks the neighborhood cop to keep him out of fights. Then, gently, Raikin concludes, "I think that none of the people can replace a mother who sings lullabies, who can answer any questions, and who feeds and comforts her child. Mothers should probably work less and pay more attention to their children. Everyone would benefit, children, parents, and the state."